I guess, do you want to introduce yourself and like talk about what we're here to talk about today?
Sure. Before I do that, is my video on, or do I have to worry about my presentation here?
We can just do voice.
Okay.
I'm very
I
tired and I don't have everything set up on OBS to do video. Like,
it's
yeah.
okay. I am a little sad that you don't get to see my Buzz Lightyear onesie, but I'll have to take a picture of it and send
Yeah,
it to
post it on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm OldManLondre. And Xander Hall was kind enough to give me an enormous boost a few weeks ago to my new YouTube channel. I'm not new to politics, though I am new to the leftist content creator space. And over the last 4 or 5 weeks or so, I think it's been, I've uploaded a few videos, and I think they're pretty decent. Trying to make them better every time. And the most recent video that I put together, I wouldn't mind if you played it, and that way you could kind of respond alongside it, unless you wanted to do it some other way. But I guess the gist of the video was my response or reaction to the recent back and forth debate between Mr. Beard and Destiny. And one of the pieces of that conversation, which really jumped out at me, which I found very troubling, was the notion that gender is something that is conditioned and something which is socially constructed, was the term.
Mhm.
And the reason why that didn't sit well with me was because it is the perhaps most fundamental underlying principle behind some of the most awful, truly transphobic legislation and just other, policies and, the mentality that people have towards trans people.
Mhm.
And and I compared it to the evolution of society's perception of gay people, and how a lot of that really shifted when people kind of got it in their heads, for the most part, that being gay isn't a choice, that there is a underlying immutable part of who you are inside that says that's just who I am.
Mhm.
I like people of the same gender. And so then it just came off as very worrisome that it felt like Mr. Beard, who I've communicated with only in replies to my posting on Twitter of my video, that I don't think that he's transphobic or a bad person for anything that he said. I just found it to be, I have big concerns, especially if you're watching all of the really awful things that are happening to the trans community
Mhm.
right now, that some of the people who are considered, really prominent and very apparent advocates for trans people are I don't want to speculate on why, but it feels to me like they're handing some very easy talking points and credence to some of the absolute worst things that are going on right now. And I just found that all very concerning. And that then led to some really good discussions on Twitter, which that sounds really dumb as it comes out of my mouth, because it's like, can that actually happen? But it actually did. And I think Lonnie would attest to that, because she was in on a lot of those conversations, but I also had a lot of really good DMs with people who pushed back on my, I guess, my pushback of what Mr. Beard said. And that was genuinely surprising to me that there were so many people who made the statement that, in fact, it is commonly a choice of what your gender is. And then that became a conversation about, you know, the difference between what I was referring to for a while, just because I wasn't sure what the correct term was to use, the difference between what I called traditional trans people. So in that sense, I just meant what I think people would traditionally, or I guess a normie perspective of what a trans person is, when you're saying, this bill is meant to target trans people in a really awful way.
Mm-hmm.
People understand you're describing a certain group, and that group, in my view, does not include non-binary people. Now, I am not saying that, because this was one of the issues that we were talking about, and I want your perspective on this, because I want to get this right. My perspective is not that non-binary people don't exist or that their experience is not valid, but there's a lot of weird feelings I have about lumping them in with trans people. Like, putting them under the trans umbrella just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, not in a way that I don't think that they deserve their own category and their own protection.
I don't mean to interrupt. I don't mean to interrupt. I apologize. But I think I might know exactly what your position is, because it's a position that I once felt kind of strongly when I initially got into the whole lefty thing and started discovering the trans stuff. And I didn't quite understand it at first, because some aspects of it seemed inherently contradictory to other positions that progressives on the left tend to hold, especially in the LGBT community. So let me see if I can rephrase your statement. Let me know if I don't do it correctly. Stop me and say, wait, that's not what I believe. And you can let me know. But here is my understanding. It feels as though those that support the idea that non-binary people are not only valid in their gender identity, one that is basically outside of the conceived gender binary, but not only that, but including them as part of the trans community, like trans people who have dysphoria, transition with medicine and surgeries and whatnot, that doing so causes harm, and that supporting the idea that gender is simply a social construct that you can choose, that is sort of ingrained into us, that is almost implicitly giving the idea that being trans is a choice, which you believe, and correctly so, to be a very harmful idea, because if we look at situations such as with being gay, it's a very common talking point by homophobes to say it's a choice, right? So to say gender is a choice or being trans is a choice, it almost comes off as making the same argument, but coming from progressives, and that really worries you. Did I get it about right?
Yeah, about right, I would say.
Okay, so let's get into the interesting stuff. Do you mind if I provide a little bit of homework at the end of this? Nothing too crazy, nothing too wild, but there's just some stuff in this that I feel I might need to reference smarter people than me to explain. But I'm going to do my best to sort of for the sake of the audience in our conversation, explain everything as well as I can based off of what I've read, and I'll cite sources and stuff as you request. Or if you just want me to, I can cite them as I reference them. Okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so we have to start at one base talking point and explain that one to begin with, okay? Sex and gender, what are they? Well, as it stands, biological sex and gender are seen as separate things by the vast majority of the medical industry, from the American Psychological Association to the National Health Service of the UK. Sex and gender are not recognized as the same thing. Not by medical associations, not by academic institutions, not by any of the big smart people that know what's up. They do not see sex and gender as the same thing. As for biological sex, they don't even view that as entirely binary. biological sex has gotten very complicated when we get up to a higher academic level. A lot of people, unfortunately, have an understanding of human biology, even when it comes to sex, chromosomes, gonads, genitals, etc., that is very, very, very low tier compared to the kind of shit that these academic institutions are studying and aware of. And a lot of people have this idea sex and gender must be the same thing. Because you walk around society every day, for the most part, chances are every female you see is going to be a woman, and every male you see is going to be a man. It's usually the case, vast majority of the time. So we're kind of given this impression that that's where you're supposed to be, right? Here, really quickly, I'm actually going to get a SciShow sex. You ever watch SciShow?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, very good shit. So they use this for like teaching students nowadays. It's like very credible. If you did a cred check on SciShow, you'd be very happy. To give you an idea of how great this video is, I just want you to open the description and look at the source section on this video. I just want to hear what your reaction to seeing the citations section of this video by SciShow is.
I'm clicking through it right now.
That is a list of sources for sure. And the video basically...
That gets me turned on with all those sources. That's like that's delicious stuff.
So the video goes on to explain that modern day, and this is from 2019, the video goes on to explain that modern day scientific consensus is not that sex and gender are the same thing, and it is not even that human biological sex is binary. Now, to be clear, 99.9 repeating an amount of times that it would be tiring to say, % of the time, the fact that there are genetic outliers from a binary is not going to be relevant to your daily life. Nonetheless, if we're looking at this from an academic, fact-based perspective, it tells us something very important. Sex cannot be Luna's little basket fell over and she had to like jump to get out of it as it fell. Oh, poor Luna.
I just want to interject just very quickly that so far there isn't anything that you have said that I disagree with. I just don't want there to be any like misunderstanding from anybody who's listening and or watching that I have any like disagreement with what you're saying.
Yeah, we have to start from like the bottom to get to the top, and like non-binary people and how their validity doesn't like invalidate binary trans people is like you kind of have to work from the bottom up to get there. It's sort of foundational. Like if I were to explain to you, here is why black people in America are disproportionately like fucked over socioeconomically, I couldn't just start like now and work my way back. I'd have to start at like, okay, so let's go back to the 1700s during colonial America. Like we'd have to go all the way back and work our way up, right? In the same way, we have to do this with the gender and sex and then up to non-binary people discussion. So I just wanted to provide this as something that you could look at and watch, sort of like a distilling of all of the scientific consensus at the time of 2019 on sex not being binary, and just provide the fact that not even biological sex is viewed as binary in the medical and academic field. But now, let's get to gender. As we know, sex and gender... Oh yeah, we got the big research document open here. Do you want me to send it to you?
That's fine.
Okay, here, let me drop that puppy for you. You're going to want to scroll down to like... Page 7. Page 7 is when the stuff starts to get relevant to our conversation. Also, you should probably save that research document. Rose Wrist made it, and it's very, very good. It's very good. Rose Wrist is like the goddamn... I don't know Rose Wrist's pronouns, but we're just going to say the monarch of putting together research documents. It's actually dope. Anyway, so these are all institutions that recognize the difference between sex and gender. They recognize that, you know, sex is not binary. Let's talk about gender. What do you believe gender is, OldManLondre? I'm just curious.
I mean, I guess it's I guess it's kind of hard for me to say because I'm just a regular vanilla straight white man, but my sense of gender is it's what you identify as. And typically that would be male or female or man or woman or neither. But then that's where, and I've, I think earlier today I was watching a debate you participated in maybe like a year ago. And there was a segment of that debate where the conversation became, okay, like, does somebody who identifies as like a deity, is, if they say that they're like Jesus Christ, is their gender, that's their identity? Well, at a certain point it gets more hairy, but generally speaking, it's your internal identification of, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll get to like the more out there identities, like xenogender identities and stuff like that, but that's a little bit down the road from this argument. We will get to it, believe me, in this conversation. I have like this isn't like scripted or anything. I haven't like planned this out, but like just if I'm going to explain like the if I were to find somebody and be like, hey, let me bread pill you on the trans thing, this is more or less the path that I go down usually. So gender, we actually don't know how gender was invented, because human record keeping goes back not nearly as far as human gender roles. The generally agreed upon like theory, you're not like a creationist or anything, are you? I don't think you are, but okay, good. So like the generally agreed upon theory is that like if we went back way back to the days of primitive humans on like the plains of Africa, you give birth, like you live with like a group of your human, like a pack or whatever. I don't know what a group of humans would be called back then. We didn't even have tribes back then, I don't think. Out there in the fucking grasslands, early humans, and you live in like your group, your tribe, whatever, of people, and you witness a woman or a female, whatever. There may not, that's not even the word for it back then. I don't think English existed. It definitely didn't. Every time you witness a new birth being done, it is almost always by the humans that are born with the breasts and the vagina and all those other secondary sex characteristics you can see on the surface. I don't know how much dissecting dead humans we were doing back then, but maybe there was that too. Regardless, it seemed a lot like you had a very limited understanding of how humans were when you saw a new human being born. And if you saw a new human in your tribe being born, you'd probably think two things, depending on how they're born. If they're born as yet another one of the humans that has breasts and a vagina, you're going to be like, okay, that's going to grow up to be what we see to be a female, which is usually skinnier, smaller, weaker, generally, as we decided back then, more accustomed to the hunting, gathering, and like staying at home, keeping the children, all that kind of stuff, right? I'm not saying none of it is instinctual, because obviously some of it is instinctual, like the raising children and stuff. Many animals in the wild do in fact feel a instinctual drive to protect their children. Humans clearly experience this as well. Postpartum depression is a thing. Hormones are a thing. Regardless, though, what comes after that seems to have been a thing that we all decided because we just realized our monkey brains. Most humans are born born and grow up to either be a big, strong, hunking dude or grow up to be a small, supple femoid, right? Like that was what we could tell with our little monkey brains out in the desert, right? And we sort of figured that out, and that sort of evolved with us and kind of evolved into the ideas that we have today. That is sort of like the most agreed upon theory of where gender and the roles of gender came from, because God knows there were no record keepers, philosophers, or people writing books about it back then. We've got cave art, and they never depict humans in cave art. Like, ironically enough, across like several continents, cave painting art almost never ever depicts humans. There's hands, like people would do blow painting of their hands. They would draw animals and tell stories, but rarely ever humans. So that's interesting. Regardless, though, we're getting a little bit off topic. This idea of what sex was, what we have now known as to be gender, has nothing to do really with your biology, especially not in modern day. Maybe when we were back, living in villages and we had hunters and gatherers, maybe the idea strong men do this, weak women do that, would have made more sense. And that very ancient sort of idea of men, women, here are the roles they're meant to fulfill, that obviously evolves over time. This is carried with us for a long time. Now, there are societies over the millennia that have recognized third, fourth genders. I know Two-Spirit is like with Native Americans is a big one. And that one, from my understanding, isn't exactly the same as how we consider like non-binary to be. It's a little bit different, but it seems as though the idea of gender being a rigid two, like binary, is mostly tied to our very surface level perception of biological sex, almost always looking like a binary, and the fact that we are raised to believe nothing else but that. Most modern day academics agree that gender, as it is called, they separate the biological side of things to biological sex, and they separate gender to be the social aspect. Not only is biological sex not a binary, we got intersex people and stuff like that, but gender has no reason to be a binary either. Why should it be? Think about it for a moment. What necessarily requires men wear suits to weddings and funerals while women wear dresses and skirts? What necessarily requires that men get more into STEM and like science and math type of fields while women typically are pushed into fields centered around caregiving and much less high income jobs? There's nothing about women's brains and men's brains inherently, maybe the caregiving part maybe, that makes this necessary, and certainly not the case in our modern society. I think humanity has broken past our primal animalistic needs and urges. I think we've kind of moved past that. And it just seems weird that our conception, based on a very surface level and incorrect analysis of sex, is still so hardcore defended. Hell, think the gender colors. What is the color for boy?
Oh, well, as a
when you think boy, what color?
32-year-old father who, well, I want to point out, yeah. I've got a son and a daughter, and we have been very, very deliberate of telling. I mean, our son is 9 months old or 10 months old, but our daughter is 6, and we can obviously tell the social pressure she gets, even when we try to shield her from it, that pink is for girls and blue is for boys. But we have been saying since she could talk, like, there's no such thing as a girl color or a boy color. You can like whatever color you want, and if your friend Johnny wants to wear, one of our earliest books that we got for her was about a boy who liked to wear pink sparkly dresses. I mean, so I typically, to try to keep this simple, yes, the general response would be, blue is for boys and pink is for girls.
Yeah. Surprisingly enough, and I do appreciate that parenting style, not really pushing anything onto your kids, though I will say, there's a phrase, no man is an island. Nobody is completely immune, regardless of their home life, to the influences of society. I mean, you said your daughter is 6. I'm sure she goes to school, right? Like public school or something. Like, I imagine the influence from classmates and just the general like spaces she's going to be in are going to influence as well. Like, I'm sure many of her classmates that are girls are going to have pink backpacks, pink binders, and that's going to be the girl color for... I mean, I didn't see girls start to adopt purple and black until, yeah, I mean, sure, but I didn't see girls start to adopt like purple and black into their liking of colors until like middle school or something. So like, yeah, I mean, these things are obviously there, and these are social pressures that are inescapable because determinism, nobody can escape society's influences on them, regardless of how much their upbringing tries to protect them from it. Believe it or not, about 100 years ago in the 1920s, pink, light pink, the hot pink color, that was the boys' color because it was seen as hotter, more rambunctious and energetic, while blue, light blue, baby blue, was seen as a girl's color because it was, sort of more toned down and softer and more gentle. And back then, the idea was that these were the colors more like the sky, more like associated with the genders. And that was how color was particularly advertised to children. Nowadays, it's very much not the case. There's nothing about these colors that necessarily makes it so that women should be more attracted to pink and men should be more attracted to blue or whatever, right? It's because our society has ingrained these ideas into us at such a young age, whether we realize it or not, just our classmates in school and the color of their binders and the way that you may not even realize it, but that's telling you in your head deep down, if I want to fit in, I got to be like them. So, gender are the social constructs, the things that we push on society. I'm not saying it's bad, and I'm not saying it doesn't matter and it's useless or anything like that. It's just something that we made up to help us as humans with higher brain function than most other animals on Earth to categorize what we see every day easier with language. The problem is that category isn't accurate. Now we get into trans people. To be transgender, and this is the academic definition of transgender, to be transgender is simply to identify as a gender identity different than the one you were assigned at birth. For those in chat that don't know, being assigned a gender at birth basically means the doctor pulls you out when you're born, looks at your genitals and says, boy, girl, and that determines how you're probably going to be raised. Simple as that. Or you see the ultrasound, and then that's where it's decided, and then that determines how the kid's gonna be raised. Hell, there's actually evidence that shows that like influence from parents that know the gender or the sex of their kid before birth, they'll do things like they'll play Mozart and they'll just typically start to orient what they expose the baby to in its gestation period, especially later on, specifically to stuff or like, oh, it's a boy? Oh, let's play doctor, like let's play Mozart, so it ends up being a doctor. Like just stuff like that, even in the womb, has an impact on some people. And there are studies that have shown that stuff coming from like very young to in the womb can have an effect on like the mindset of a child. Like we don't know exactly how young the brain becomes capable of taking in information and internalizing it. It's very interesting stuff. There are some studies about it in the research document I sent you, though, I think, so it's worth checking out if you want to control F for it. Anyway, with that said, you were assigned a gender at birth, and to be transgender is simply to identify as a gender not the same one you were assigned at birth, whether it be non-binary, you were assigned male at birth and you identify as a woman, or you're assigned as a woman at birth and you identify as a man. That makes you trans by the academic definition of trans, period. Now, that alone isn't a very good argument. Like, oh, well, technically, by that definition, I guess the non-binary people... Okay, sure. Yeah, all right. Clearly, if you have gender dysphoria, and I know you know what gender dysphoria is, right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, for those in chat, gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. It is actually categorized as a mental health condition, one that, as the research document I sent, overwhelmingly demonstrates based on the data and the consensus of the scientific and medical communities that transitioning and broader societal close friend and family support is the only effective way to treat gender dysphoria, which is why all the medical professionals say, if a trans person is trans, you support their identity. That is how you help them. That is the designated DSM-5. We might be on the 6 now, but the DSM-5 has like the guidelines for this is what you do with somebody who has gender dysphoria, and it is validation and giving access to hormones and so on based on like the guidelines. There are guidelines set out and everything, and the doctors follow a process. I'm not going to pretend like I know every step of it. I'm not a doctor, but it's there, right? DSM-5 is publicly available, and you can look at the trans section. Now, obviously, if you are binary trans, as in like a trans woman, trans man, and you have gender dysphoria, this is decidedly different than, say, a non-binary person who does not have dysphoria, does not really change their pronouns or anything about the way they present, and yet still says that they are trans. That sounds almost like almost disrespectful and very harmful. And I understand where you're coming from the perspective of someone who's one, seeing it from this perspective, or two, if you are a binary trans person yourself. I disagree, though, and let me explain why. There is evidence to show that non-binary people get dysphoria that seems to be alleviated by being recognized as non-binary, being referred to by they, them pronouns, being, in many cases, presenting androgynously. That's not always the case for non-binary people with dysphoria even, or just non-binary people, period. But I know non-binary people who actively seek out, being presented as entirely androgynous, essentially, or very androgynous, as they do not like the idea of fitting into any gender role, or even really care about, like, sex. Their gender identity and presentation exists outside of that, of the gender binary that we are taught and forced to live under. Now, dysphoria is there, so sure, you can make the argument that the dysphoria is what makes a trans person valid. But should that really be where we draw the line? Think about it for a moment. Think all the way back to Stonewall. Think all the way back to the Stonewall riots. That entire movement was started by trans people. And yet, despite the fact that Stonewall resulted in massive leaps forward for the acceptance of gay and lesbian people, binary trans people haven't even started to see broader acceptance until like 6 or 7 years ago, max. Like full-on broader acceptance to the point where people are losing their jobs for misgendering a trans person in their workplace. Like, can you imagine that 10 plus years ago? Of course not. And the reason for that is the Stonewall movement, particularly wealthy, white, lesbian women and gay men, saw trans people as being too crazy, too insane, and too degenerate for them to allow in their movement, for them to be allowed to be shown to the public. Like, we can get acceptance way before these freaks can, so let's just completely kick them out. That was basically the mindset. And that's what happened. Trans acceptance was left behind in the dust, left in the dust by the Stonewall movement, and we didn't start to see broader trans acceptance until very, very recently. And now it feels as though we've got non-binary people. Sure, we've got non-binary people without dysphoria who identify with who identify as different genders. We've already established that gender is socially constructed, though. I mean, do you have any arguments for why gender ought not be something that you can just identify as, even if we recognize the differences between, like, a non-dysphoric non-binary person, a dysphoric non-binary person, dysphoric binary trans people, and cis people? I feel like we can still, like, categorize that all in the umbrella of trans, but talk about them in different ways. Like, I mean, you've seen my streams. I talk about trans stuff all the time, and I don't really feel like my recognizing non-binary people, even people with who identify as non-binary or with other, like, neo-pronouns, neo and xenogenders, which I guess we can get that in a minute. Like, I don't see how that and my believing in their validity gets in the way of my ability to consistently and in a well thought out way defend the rights and validity of, like, binary trans people with like dysphoria. I just don't see how it harms them. What really seems to harm them the most is the culture war narrative built around it. And that's what really seems to be the big problem. People will see somebody like, I'm not actually going to make any specific examples because that feels rude. Somebody will see somebody who identifies with a xenogender, somebody who has a gender identity that is just so seemingly out there that it just blows their mind, right? And their immediate reaction, if we're being completely honest, is one of a negative amazement, likely of disgust, followed up by a level of hatred. And I mean, come on, plenty of people feel this way. And they use examples like this and how they are seemingly, I should say, very crazy. And they use this as an argument against all trans people. And I've seen people use that phenomenon as an argument against people who are non-binary or who use xenogenders or neopronouns. The problem there aren't the people identifying how they please and doing their own thing, no matter how cringy or weird you think their identity is. The people who ought to be blamed for this, who ought to be attacked, are the people who are using them as weapons or ammo against trans people. And not only that, but but I'm not accusing you of this, but I'm accusing, like,
I was going to say,
but not only that, or sorry.
Didn't you not just say, though, I mean, right there, that they're using this category of non-binary against trans people? So
I'm saying that people feel that way.
No, I mean, like, I'll go back and rewatch the clip, and I trust what.
I don't think that you said that. I'm just saying that many people do feel that way on the right. I'm talking about like the right wingers who use the existence of somebody like with a xenogender or neo pronoun, who use their identity against the trans community. Not that, like, I'm not claiming you said non-binary people use their identity against the trans community. I'm saying that conservatives and transphobes will take an example of like a xenogender or neopronoun user and then say, look how crazy this person is, because most of their audience and them have no understanding of like gender, sex, or the science that goes into it. And then they will say, look how crazy this person is. That's what all trans people are like. And you see that. I'm not saying you see that. Well, actually, I mean, it seems like you see that. And that comes off to you as though, oh my God, look at what these non-binary and xenogender neopronoun users are doing. They are giving ammo to the right, and essentially their arguments for their own validity are basically like giving arguments to the right. But that's not true. There's nothing about gender necessarily that's necessarily that inherent to you. The gender part of it is seemingly our way of physically demonstrating our like internal feelings. As far as dysphoria goes, it almost always seems to be something having to do with the body. Not always, but a lot of the time it is. That's why a lot of the time, like, trans men will get top surgery and stuff like that and go on TRT, and why a lot of trans women will get FFS, bottom surgery, and go on, HRT and stuff like that. It just seems like there's no real utility we get from lending credence to the right's arguments that people who are doing nothing to hurt anybody, whose identities do not, by the definitions of trans or the definitions of gender, like none of them are factually incorrect, and you can't really provide evidence. I don't think you could provide evidence claiming that. It doesn't really seem useful to try to like pull a stone wall and say, oh, this new group of people we think are too like radical and crazy and bad optics for the public to accept. Let's push them back and their rights and their acceptance back another 20 years. And then realize down the road, okay, wait, maybe that wasn't as valid as we thought. It just feels like it's not. It just isn't a good idea to immediately jump on this group of people who's claiming their identity is valid and they're just doing their own thing are wrong, because every time a group of people have done that and we're really confident they were in the right, they always end up in the wrong looking back, it feels like. I mean, like, look at the history of civil rights. The vast majority of people who are on the wrong side of the civil rights marches probably believed 100% that their ideas were correct, and that if you could ever even challenge those ideas, you're basically challenging the fundamental basic facts of the universe to them. To say that, like, back in the slavery times, that black people are just as human and worthy of respect and rights as white people, that would be just as crazy as what I'm saying to you now to them, I'm sure, even more crazy. I don't know. It just seems like I want to stop people from potentially engaging in a repeat of history.
Yeah, and then this is where it is so frustrating for me, because I mean, for one, it sounds like there's a misreading of what my position is.
Well, if you have any like particular questions for me to answer, I can do that too. I can't go over everything.
Oh my God, I have a ton, but I didn't want to interrupt because I didn't want to present this as a debate where I'm trying to convince you and you're trying to. I actually, for anybody watching, I sought this out so that I could make sure that I was as informed on this as possible. So let me, if you allow me to take like 11 steps back, just high level, I feel like you kept using the word academic, and I had written down philosophy, and I wrote that down prior to us having this conversation, because it's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, the distinction between having this conversation from a philosophical academic standpoint versus I don't know what the right word is for it, but
a practical standpoint,
reality,
maybe?
Practical, present, right now, the actual politics part of it. Because I'm far less interested in the big overarching philosophical, get the philosophy right. Because if you get the philosophy 100% right, just amongst the online left, that is pretty well irrelevant, because meanwhile, the really evil right is actually passing really horrible anti-trans, anti-gay legislation, like, as we speak.
Okay, can I interrupt for just a second? Wait, I'll let you finish first.
Sure. I was just going to say, I mean,
I'll let you go first. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I talked a lot before.
It's okay. I feel like the left has a very nasty habit of making things, even things that are already complicated, dwelling on the complications, making things super complicated. And having run for office myself numerous times, I've lost and I've won. I've worked on dozens of campaigns. Most of them have won. I know that the people who tend to vote and the people who tend to get the state legislators elected, who then pass these really horrible bills, they do not, you can't knock on their door and have a 45-minute conversation with them about the amorphous nature of gender and the, like, making this super complicated, when it's, if it's complicated for you and I to talk about, what do you think is going to happen when you knock on the door of a 65-year-old woman named Elaine and her husband Ted, who vote in every single election, and you're trying to talk to them about how this anti-trans bill that their legislator recently supported is a terrible thing, if you can't really even, like, define in a concise way what it means to be trans? Because even if you have, like, I think of people like some of my older relatives who are in the Midwest, just like me, who just maybe like a decade ago were far more conservative than they are now. It takes time to get them to move over, but these are the people who do vote, who have the capacity to stop and prevent these kinds of bills from passing. And if I were to try to sit down with, like, my grandparents and try to, like, have this conversation with them, I don't, that would be quite frankly a waste of time in the present, because what I'm most concerned about is, in the present moment, we have very specific states that are, and potentially national political figures who are trying to do and are succeeding in doing really, really terrible things, targeting trans people. And I do question whether or not even those bills, when they are written, this is just a genuine question, do you think that they are, I think they are designed to target, I guess, binary trans people. Do you think that when some whacked out, you know, not Atlanta, because Atlanta's very progressive, but some Georgian legislator, or Alabama was the one that just passed something today. Do you think that those legislators were thinking about non-binary people? Or do you think they were thinking about,
probably
like,
not, because they're boomers, but that doesn't matter. The effects are still the same. This Don't Say Gay bill will affect young non-binary people the same way it affects young gay and trans people.
Yes, I tend to agree with that, but I do think that even in I think it's important to understand, and my approach comes from the place of when we can have these very detailed conversations, and I do want to understand the philosophy and history and all that stuff, but I also want to make sure that we're not out there while having these kinds of kind of sometimes amorphous conversations about gender abolition and these kind of like wonky, I'm not saying bad ideas, but kind of wonky ideas. Um, we're how are we communicating that to like the average person
Okay.
who when go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I got you. I got you, my friend. Okay. So the general like core of what you said was that the philosophy may be correct. Sure. Okay. If we go down the list, we look at the data, we look at all of this. It's a complicated and long-winded conversation, but sure, the philosophy of it lines up. Sure, these gender identities are valid, but how do you explain this to right-wing voters when all around the country there are these local right-wing politicians winning elections on these gender-related culture war talking points? That more or less cover what you meant?
Kind of. I would go a step further, though, as to say that if somebody like myself, and I would go, I will probably get crucified in chat for this, but I think even somebody like Destiny, who is constantly labeled, and I'm not a DGGer, but I'm just saying, I've had interactions with people who vehemently I don't want to say disagree with me on this because I don't have a super firm position at this point. Otherwise, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you. But when you look at all the really horrible shit that is going on currently, targeting trans people in particular, and there seems to be a very callous way that we're kind of saying, yeah, we don't really need you, like traditional, like I'm more to the left probably than Destiny. But the average Democratic voter is more center than Destiny is. And if you're going to push away people like Destiny or potentially me because we're not yet like totally on board with like neo pronouns, and like if you can't make this simple enough for me to be totally on board with, then you're totally fucked when it comes to like not conservative voters, but even like regular Democratic voters who are the people who are going, or Democratic legislators. Like,
yeah, so
do you think when you're talking to Joe Biden and he's like out there, thankfully, saying very positive, affirmative things about trans people and the validity of their experience, do you think that when he's talking about that, he's talking about, you know, people who can identify as, and I won't use a specific because I also don't want to be insulting, but I guess I did earlier. So like somebody identifies as Jesus Christ. Was one of my earlier questions too was going to be like, do you feel like there is any identity that is too out there? Because you said something to the effect of like, and then you get into these, you know, neo pronouns or whatever you said that are, you know, you might think are a little bit too out there, which made me wonder, is there a point at which it is too out there? And
right.
Why do you draw that line?
Sure. As a matter of fact, I'm going to draw a line on the notepad doc I'm using. Okay, perfect. Do you mind if I answer your any identity too out there for me question after I acknowledge the original, like the points that came before it?
Yeah, totally. I'm going to let my cat out of the room because he's clawing at the door.
All good.
1 second. I'm sure that half of your chat is going to think that this is like too painful to get through, but I'm hoping another half will be like, oh, this is fun. I get to watch an old man like work through this shit like in real time. Because honestly, like this is the kind of thing that like if we want to move from just purely philosophical academic conversations that are either online or in insulated safe spaces to actually like to get out into the real world in front of real voters. We're going to have conversations like this with people like me, but who are actually much less sympathetic.
Before I respond to your main point, I actually have a quick hypothetical question for you. Okay. Okay. Let's say hypothetically you've got like you're doing some you're just going door to door trying to get somebody to elect your guy that you're pushing for, and you knock on a door and you open it up and the guy opens it up and he's this MAGA hat wearing not even just some average, I don't know, like Georgia fucking redneck guy, right? And he's like, all right, OldManLondre, come on in. And you go on in there and you sit down with him and having a bit of tea and you're talking about how you want to get him to elect whoever the fuck. And he's like,
the MAGA guy serving me up a cup of tea. Yeah, that's...
well, not even MAGA, just like some random conservative. They're not even a conservative, just a random white guy you knocked on the door of, right? Just your average Georgia white voter. That's what we'll say. Lets you in, gives you some tea. He's like, all right. And you ask, what are your most important political topics? And he says, well, I've been watching a lot of Fox News lately, and Tucker's on there talking a lot about them transgenders, whatever they're called. I don't know. I don't want them coming into the bathroom with my wife or my daughter, and I don't want them competing in the sports or whatever. And that's what you're probably going to get from your average like anti-trans normie type. I will tell you that's actually not what I'm going to get, because I'm just playing the hypothetical out. You would know that person, there's a way that campaigns actually operate. It's frightening how much political parties and campaigns know about a person before you knock on their door. Oh, and I would never end up knocking on their door. In that case, let's do an even better analogy. Let's say you knock on their door, you let them in, they say, yeah, I think we got a big problem with crime. I think black people commit way too much of it. And you're like, oh. And you're like, okay, how are we gonna work through this? Okay. Now, would you ever in your life advocate that black people in impoverished areas that resort to crime because there's not much in the way of other options, would you ever say it would be okay for the black community, quote unquote, to disown like them because they contribute to the racist narrative that black people are criminals and thus contributing to the prevalence of racism and racist policy in America? You would never do this, because we should never compromise our principles and what we know is right and true because it's unpopular. We should want to win and we should focus on winning, but I don't think that to do so, we have to sacrifice our principles and what we know is true, even philosophically, even if it doesn't come off well, even if it's bad optics, and even if it's complicated to explain. Like I said before, I mean, imagine trying to explain to somebody in the 1940s that being gay isn't a choice and it's fine and it's not bad, it's not degenerate. Like, it'd be pretty hard to do that. And yes, that this kind of stuff did happen over time, but, well, let me read a quote to you really quick. It's not too long, but it's by Martin Luther King, and I think it applies pretty well to this situation, despite it not being about race. Just bear with me.
Go ahead.
I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright objection. It goes on to repeat the same general sentiment, that to MLK, one of the most influential civil rights figures of all time, what he was most upset by were those that really did mean well, who were like progressives who, for the time, and wanted to see freedom reached, but didn't agree with the radicalism, the optics, so on and so on. In fact, I can send a very good MLK or anti-MLK political comic. You know, people frame MLK as having been this very peaceful demonstrator who just engaged in civil disobedience, like sitting in a diner that black people aren't allowed in, just minding their own business. And people did stuff like that, but well, let's just go ahead and see, and let me show you a political comic that depicts how the derision from MLK and the civil rights movement framed this movement back then. Look at this. I plan to lead another non-violent march tomorrow. MLK and a reporter with a city burning around. This is no different than the kind of Ben Garrison tier political... This looks like it was made by Ben Garrison's grandfather. Probably his dad, actually. It looks like it was made by Ben Garrison's dad, frankly. The labeling is even there. How is this any different than the kind of propaganda, talking points, and policy, like the propaganda used to make people support policies that was used back then against the civil rights movement? Their fight was true and just and correct, regardless of how radical, unpopular, and bad it made them. And the civil rights protesters of back in the day did not care if their protesting made them look mean and violent and played into what racists were saying about them, because they knew what they were doing was right, they knew it was true, they knew it was just, and they fought for it anyway. And now, after the fact, we look back on MLK and all those that were on his side as heroes, and we look back on the people that stood against him as the villains. And yet we somehow managed to whitewash history so much that we put into people's minds this idea that to achieve actual change in this country, as far as social progress goes, it has to be a slow, deliberate thing that makes sure that all the optics are perfect and everybody's totally on board. That's never going to happen. There will always be people pushing horrible policies, and there will always be practical problems with keeping to our principles. But I believe it is very important that we do so. We need to stay to our principles, even if it's not convenient.
Wait, okay, so there's a couple things. For one, whoops, I just knocked something over. So for two, I think
that once we start... Don't you think that once we start poking holes in identities and telling people, hey, your identity is insane dog shit and it's not valid, don't you think that that's like maybe a little bit too close to feeling like you might be on the same side of history as those that we look back on as being the bad guys? It's always the people who are trying to hold back progress that are looked back on as the bad guys.
So what I appreciate the history of MLK. I don't know, I can't do the math in my head right now of if you were of voting age in the
certainly not
2007 primaries between Obama and Hillary, and they had a very infamous moment on stage at one of the early debates where Obama made the case that you were making, and I was Team Obama from day one. I couldn't stand Hillary, and I still can't. She was, well, let me back up. Obama said something to the effect of what you said about MLK. We can't have, like a slow progress, a piecemeal process. We need radical change. I loved that. And then Hillary said something to the effect of, yeah, but he basically needed a white president to be able to sign the Voting Rights Act and various forms of civil rights legislation, which was factually accurate, but in the moment, terrible optics, really dumb. The other issue I have is that you're right to say that there is a big problem with being willing to go really slow with this stuff. But I would argue that if we have to get the whole world on the same philosophical playing field, or we're all in philosophical agreement on this amorphous, still being studied.
Well, everything's still being studied. Let's not frame it as though it's not fairly well settled as far as sciences go into this type of field. I mean, the data is pretty overwhelmingly pointing to the same thing. I mean, science is all about changing your position when new information comes on. But
in the debate that was like a year ago, that we're still learning a lot about gender. My point is, whether or not the scientific community or the academic community is in agreement, you could look at climate change as an example. Like, the scientific consensus on climate change has been there for decades, but it has taken way too fucking long to get everybody else on board. And
so should we stop advocating for people to be aware about climate change just because it's not popular and people don't care?
If that was what I was going to argue,
I felt like, I'm sorry, my debate broness came out for a second. It happens.
Yeah, I could feel it.
I'll be having like a normal conversation, and then my debate bro will come out, and I'll catch somebody, and I'll feel like I got to do the gotcha. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. My bad.
It's all good. This is not the normal environment for you or I, so it's all good. My concern is that we're spending so much time talking about the philosophy that just look at the current playing field for trans people. They're getting their ass kicked, and I'm concerned that we're so preoccupied with just having these kinds of philosophical conversations that continue to expand in terms of like, who are we actually talking about? And because I don't think that the vast majority of people who are engaged with this outside of these kinds of spaces, I don't think that they're talking about the same kind of people as when you or most of the people in chat when they hear trans, the average person is not thinking about the same group of people that you are.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. Just because the broader public is wrong doesn't mean we shouldn't push to make them right. The way that you push these ideas, by the way, we can validate all trans identities without invalidating others. This isn't like an any-all type thing.
And by the way, I've explicitly said publicly that I do not intend to invalidate anybody's experience, because I have no right to do that or reason to do that. But my concern is just that the way that we are going about this, the way we're having these conversations, and the way that we are it seems to me so focused on the philosophy part of it. And I'm not even saying that in my notes I've written, and now I regret not saying it, that I don't think that either philosophy or real world, the actual politics, like the now part, I don't think that either one of those is better or worse than the other. I think that we should strive to be right on the philosophy, but I also think that we should be very careful. I mean, even in like all the stuff that you said about Noah, like I had written down, like like you said some stuff about like just giving ammunition to the really, really bad people who actually want to harm these perfectly valid human beings.
What do I criticize in my video about Noah that gives ammo to the right? What specifically do I criticize?
No, you're not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that
I've said as much. I've said what Noah does provide ammo to the right. What I'm asking you is, in what context did I say so? Because I highly doubt that the context in which I said he gives ammo to the right is his advocating for certain gender identities or any beliefs. The things that I think make him look bad are the fact that he's incapable of defending his arguments, he lies nonstop, he tries to go on constant drama hit piece drama bait sprees, it seems, and he's kind of a dishonest cunt, and it would be very easy for right-wingers just see his videos, see what a liar he is, and completely dunk on him and make a whole new genre of content out of it. I believe that's what I said. I don't think that ideas or principles alone should ever be seen as something that is like, well, many times it can be. Obviously, there's positions that are wrong that are bad optics, but if a position is correct or reasonably correct and has decent, I can make a decent argument for why I believe it. I've never once found any other situation other than this where somebody would ever argue that I should sacrifice my principles in this issue just because it's like kind of bad optics. Like, imagine like going to a slave owner back in like the 1700s and being like, hey, slavery is wrong, and then he asks why, and you're like, well, I can't talk about philosophy because that's really hard. Like, we can't really get into that, but like, and then the slave owner's like, look how much money it makes me. The cotton gin just got invented. I'm making a shit ton of and then like, that's how it would go, right? You'd have to, like, if you even wanted a chance, have to get into the philosophical argument of why do you think people born with a different skin color from a different place are lesser humans than you, and have that discussion with somebody. That is how you have to de-radicalize someone from racism. If you want to see a very good example of this, there's a guy who went on Joe Rogan to tell his story, but he's done a lot of TED Talks. He's very famous. I believe his name is Daryl.
He's awesome. He's amazing.
But this is the KKK de-radicalizer guy. You have to have long philosophical discussions like that and personal interactions in order to deprogram these kind of ideas out of people's minds. And I think these transphobic ideas, the ones that you worry about the right preying on to pass these policies, are ones that have been ingrained in us from a very long time. And I think that content like mine that goes out of its way to educate people on the reality of this does my part. I am doing my part to help contribute to creating a society in which people think of non-binary people the same as they think of gay people, or more recently, it seems, as binary trans people, as not a group of people to be ridiculed or mocked, but as another group of people that has been marginalized for a very long time, deserves to be treated with equal respect, provided with equal rights, and while yes, does have some accommodations society has to make in order to reach that validity, those accommodations are essentially no different than the accommodations society has had to make in the past in order to make the world more fair. Back in the day, during the desegregation times, tons and tons and tons of white people were super against the idea of desegregation because they didn't want to be around black people in their spaces. That didn't matter. We still pushed for that, even though it was really unpopular with a lot of racist white people, because we recognize as progressives, I'm not saying we, but the civil rights movement, the progressives going back in time, realized it doesn't matter how much pushback we get. If we lay down and take it, there will never be a more convenient season. There will never be a time where these people will allow us our time in the sun. We have to fight. Fight like you're the third monkey boarding Noah's Ark and brother, it's starting to rain, because that is the only way to bring about actual change in this country. The only reason slavery isn't a thing anymore is because we had the Civil War. We fought a whole war to end slavery. Just because issues are divisive does not mean we should ever stop our pursuit of justice and freedom and truth.
I have 100% never advocated for the position it sounds like you're trying to ascribe to me, which is very frustrating. And also, it's just, I feel like our headspaces are so, we're starting from very different places. What I keep imagining, I mean, I spent a decade in direct politics, progressive politics, and I'm just envisioning myself at a door with somebody. Do you, this will sound condescending and I apologize, but have you ever like done direct?
Sadly, no. I've always wanted to, and I do plan to in the future, but up to this date, the closest direct action I have done has been voting. I mean, I guess I've
and that's cool.
donated to that stuff, but that's not really direct action, is it?
If the camera was on, I think you'd probably have an easier time of being able to tell that I'm not presenting this as like
I know a little bit of your background. You've got a lot of experience doing direct action. I know that. Sure. Just to make sure the audience knows that the person who is talking right now has more experience, knows way more about doing direct action, convincing people, like knocking on doors, shit like that than I do. Just putting that out there.
Here's where I'm coming from. I'll try to simplify it a lot. I want fewer of the bad guys to get elected, and I want more of the good people to get elected to do good things and less bad things happen. Here, I would like to ask, because you've made it sound like you go to a door and some Georgian or Wisconsinite voter, and you're going there with the intention of de-radicalizing them. How long do you think that conversation would have, and how long do you think the typical knocking on somebody's door to give them a flyer for your favored candidate, how long do you think that conversation would happen?
I watched a lot of Destiny's canvassing streams when he did the was it Mark Grudgel thing? I watched a lot of his canvassing streams, and it seems like usually you're not going to get a lot of answers. You're going to leave a lot of things on doors, and then when people do actually answer, they'll probably like stick their head out, be like, oh, okay, I'll take that. Like, they don't really want to talk, and then occasionally you get a conversation, and at most it'll last a few seconds. I know this because the highlights of Destiny's canvassing were like 4 videos maybe, in which he actually was able to get into full-on debates with people that lasted a significant amount of time, long enough for a video. So I'm not acting as though the average person is going to give you the time of day long enough for me to explain everything I've explained to you, and then probably more, because the debate's not over yet. Like, obviously, that's not realistic.
It's not a debate, bro.
No, not a debate. Sorry, it's... My apology. The conversation or whatever. The conversation as up to now, it's not over yet. So, I mean, I imagine we still have more ground to cover. So there'd be more ground to cover with another person. It wouldn't even just be the however long we've been talking. And I understand that. But I don't really think that's a practical explanation for why this is happening. The CRT stuff, where did that really, really come from? Sure, there was like a couple of companies that were teaching actual like weird anti-white, like white guilt stuff, but like those people pushing that were fired, and it was all like done away. Like, it's not anywhere near as big of an issue as the conservatives make it out to be, and yet now they are getting elected almost all over the country on the sole issue of banning CRT from schools, which is actually banning like anything that talks about the civil rights movement, slavery, and anything that doesn't teach America as being like not racist. So doesn't that signal that the right isn't just this like, it almost sounds like when you talk about society and like the pushback against progression, like it's this solid block, like a solid block that we are the ones aggressing against and pushing. And while we are aggressing against it to push society more to the progressive side, the brick is pushing back. And it always has been. The right, bigots, and fascists, who I'm not saying every single voter that isn't on board with this is on board with. All I'm saying is propaganda from right-wingers, bigots, and fascists, your Tucker Carlsons, whatnot, travel down to their audience, and those ideas permeate through society broadly. The vast majority of people on the street, if you ask them, is a trans woman a woman? They would probably say, well, not really. Like, most likely. That's where we are right now in society. Even though people are still getting fired for misgendering, we're at a very divisive point for trans people, binary dysphoria experiencing, HRT taken, TRT taken, surgery getting trans people. We are still so divided, even here in America, over that. Don't even talk to me about the fucking UK. But like, even there, we're so divided. And that is because the right has always pushed back. What are non-binary people and trans people really asking for at the end of the day? Not that much. Not really that much. Like, sure, you might have to, like socially speaking, as far as like social movements go, we're asking people, which is where most of this is, by the way, we're asking people to be broadly more accepting of trans people. That's where I think you've got the best like optics argument to make, but even then I think we can still work through that. And then you've got the legislative area, where you've got people that are getting elected and, you know, sort of like, or sorry, not legislative, like you've got the government area, like your local elections. You've got people getting elected and pushing policies that are based on culture war issues their voters agree with. Where are their voters getting this information? From right-wing figures pushing propaganda. We need left-wing figures pushing the opposite propaganda. That's what I can do. I can educate people who watch my content and bring them to a position that will make them more amiable to certain ideas. We just...
Yeah, but good propaganda is not
happened. We're
complicated,
moving
though.
in the right direction. Blorgia happened. We are moving in the right direction, even if the right's going to swing back. We can't cede to them. We can't let a whole group of people that is just advocating for their own acceptance and their own identity to be, broadly accepted and for just to be treated well and to be treated kindly and not seen as freaks to society, which is what a lot of society sees them as and a part of what they want to fight against. Listen, I'm not saying you do. Listen, chat, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be so mean, but I'm being very brutally honest about the positions of a lot of people in society that are transphobic, and they do hold disgustingly virulent positions because, we know this, there are studies that show this, conservatives are more quick to the disgust response than most other political groups on average. Conservatives have typically, and I don't think this is like a genetic thing, I just think it's more of like a learned behavior, are the part of their brain that initiates due to disgust initiates much faster, quicker, into more stimuli easier than the average like lefty. Mm-hmm. We need to program that kind of stuff out of society. Stop making people so inherently bigoted towards those that are different.
Yeah, that's like the long game.
It's not the long game. We fight this fight every day. I fight this fight every day. You fight this fight every tweet you make, every video you upload. That is the fight that we are fighting. We cannot back down. I don't see how me giving way to, just giving way to the right and saying, you know what? The dear gender people, the non-binary people, they are just too radical and crazy. You know what? We're only backing up the binary trans people with dysphoria because it is the easiest to just drop a couple of links to somebody and say, here you go, that's why they're valid, and just leave all of them behind. And then 20 years from now, 15, 10 years from now even, because the internet makes time go faster, it feels like, we're going to look back and be like, oh, we kind of were in the wrong, weren't we? Yikes. I don't know.
I think one of the issues that the philosophical part misses too is that, we can get the philosophy right in our friendly left circle. And then, 20 years from now, when half of the United States has passed horrible, unimaginably horrible anti-LGBT legislation, 20 years from now, what is the value in us being able to pat ourselves on the back, it being able to say, yeah, but we were right? Meanwhile, you've had all of these lives destroyed, made incredibly painful. I'm sure thousands of people having killed themselves or going through unimaginable mental health crises. I get where you're coming from. I don't think that we need to sacrifice any of our core principles. What I guess I'm really arguing is that I have bigger concerns specifically about how we are going about talking about this.
It just
amongst ourselves and publicly, because it's cool that we can just chat online in these kinds of formats in a very casual way. But I think when we do that, we often forget that these are public conversations. You pointed out that it's going to take, if you watched my video, I included that bit in there with the poorly deep faked Ben Shapiro thing, because I'm making the point that when we are having these conversations that feel like it's just, privately between friends who are kind of on the left trying to figure things out, when we have these conversations, they are public and they can be weaponized if we are not careful. And it strikes me as, and I'm not saying this is you, but I've even seen in chat, some people said be careful. What does that mean? That strikes me as incredibly childish and naive. That there's no value in being careful about our words. I mean, is that now the position of the left, that we can just be
I think
super careless with our words? Because in
no,
the gender conversation,
Being careless isn't advocating for a group of people, a marginalized group. And let's be real, non-binary people are marginalized.
No, that's not what I'm saying, though. I'm saying how we are doing that advocacy, how we are verbalizing.
How are we doing that advocacy? That's the problem.
If you watch my video, what I'm saying is that was done. I think that...
I just need one example. Just one example of, like, careless advocacy that, like, you think is an example of a problem.
No. I'm saying, like, literally word choice.
There's just got to be, like, okay, one example of, like, here's something that someone on this side of things said that I think does a lot to harm the trans movement and does a lot to give ammo to the, like, contributes to the problems that you've brought up before.
Just to be clear, did you watch the video yet?
I haven't seen that video, no.
Okay, so in that video, the focus was on the specific statement by Mr. Beard that people choose their gender. That it is so right next to what he said, I had a clip. I had the shortened clip, but then I also had the bigger context piece of it, of the literal founder of conversion therapy stating that conversion therapy can work because your sexual orientation and your gender identity is a social construct. Now, when the literal founder of conversion therapy is saying that it is a social construct, and therefore, because it is a social construct, it can be deconstructed, I am not buying his argument. What I am saying is that when people who are genuinely doing their best to advocate, and I think that he was, Mr. Beard, I think that he was trying to be a great advocate, but then when you're using the same language as the conversion therapy people, that worries me. And I don't know how that would be odd, that would be worrisome to anybody.
That is guilt.
Because you're lending credibility to the very fundamental argument.
Do you know how gender dysphoria was discovered? This is a very important question because I feel like it really does bring it all back around. Do you know how gender dysphoria was discovered?
I would assume that they asked somebody or some group of people who was experiencing it, but
I guess
no.
Technically it was discovered well before. Discovery is an interesting concept, but the credit is mostly given to a guy by the name of John Money. Have you ever heard of this guy? What he did was pretty fucked up. There were two twin boys who were born and had a botched circumcision. One of them had a botched circumcision, maybe both of them. It's been a while since I heard the story. And this guy was a fucking ghoul. What he did was he took these two kids and gave one of them, like, the one that got the botched circumcision, a forced, like, vaginoplasty, I think the term is. Though, judging by the fact that it was done by a mad scientist in the basement of his house back in the 1950s, probably means it probably wasn't the best operation. But that was more or less the understanding that we got. And he was raised as a girl. Despite having been born a boy, was forced to be raised as a girl. And this child experienced all of the symptoms of dysphoria that we saw in trans people. And that is when we really started to realize, despite the horrible person and way looking back that this was discovered, we realized there is something about your sex, and gender dysphoria is sort of a bad phrase. It's actually kind of getting phased out now for just dysphoria, or sexual dysphoria, because it's not, gender is the wrong word to have as a prefix for it. It seems like dysphoria roots somewhere deeper than just our identity. However, and it's worth acknowledging this, and this is a really interesting part, there are trans people, binary trans people, who do not seek out medical transition because their dysphoria lies way more on their social presentation. There are a lot of, I'm not going to say like exactly how many or even ballpark it, but there are a fair amount of trans people that don't really have much dysphoria when it comes to their penis. Like a trans woman doesn't have much dysphoria when it comes to their penis. There are trans men who don't have much transphobia when it comes to their chest, or dysphoria when it comes to their chest. And they mostly feel their dysphoria alleviated by broader social expression being recognized as valid. Many times it takes surgeries to do this, and sometimes it just takes the acceptance, right? This is the case for quite a few trans people. There are also many non-binary people, as I mentioned before, that seek out surgeries, get HRT, and feel dysphoria alleviated by seeking out actual medical transition despite their identity being that non-binary, right? It feels as though the instinctual, and you're pointing this out because people do have this, and you are right. People have an instinctual disgust response to an idea like that. The idea that that gender, something so fundamental that we've understood since we were so young, probably one of the first things that we came to understand, mommy, daddy, that was what gender, man, woman, that was what we came to understand probably at the youngest age possibly. The idea that this could be challenged, the idea that this was an idea, a antique idea that is a leftover remnant of ancient times that maybe isn't as in line with modern day science, data, and philosophy, isn't something we should fight against and hide because it makes us look bad. I think we can advocate for these ideas, and I think optics does matter. I just don't think what we're arguing for should ever be the consideration when it comes to optics, if it is correct. Obviously, if it's wrong, we shouldn't be arguing for it in the first place. But I don't think we should ever say, oh, this position we hold that is correct, and here's why. Well, if we keep pushing it so hard, then people are going to think we're insane. Republicans will get elected, and then they'll push anti-trans policies. Let's hold off on that. No, the same Republicans would probably have gotten elected anyway, and eventually the same anti-trans policies would have been pushed anyway. Every single step that a marginalized group tries to take in order to receive more acceptance and rights and freedom means that the opposing faction of anti-progress, we'll just call it anti-progress, will always push back. It's like a non-Newtonian fluid that you can't just seep into. It's always solid. It's like a brick, actually. It feels like your perspective, you said my perspective was kind of childish, but it feels like your perspective is the more childish one based on the idea that if the left concedes and amorphosizes itself around a certain set of ideas or beliefs or optical sort of looks, that the right will be like, well, we were wrong the whole time. Or at the very least, they'd have nothing to go after. There will always be teenagers on TikTok or on Tumblr or whatever that we have no control over that will do something that the right will use one single Tumblr teenager to start an entire movement and narrative off of. That's all it takes. That's all it takes for the right to start something. They are massive fucking self-victimizers. They've got nothing to complain about and nothing to bitch about. They manufacture all their own oppression. We have the responsibility of calling it out and never ceding to them. Only ever changing our mind, ceding a position when we are wrong, as in incorrect. That's my impression, at least.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you just said, because I don't feel like you're still...
But we do, though, don't we? Because your argument at the end of the day is that practically, if we advocate for the rights and the validity of these crazy out there gender identities, and we can go into that in a minute.
Said that. And that is not what I'm saying. I'm merely saying that the way that we talk about things does matter. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. It would be like we can use any other policy prescription. Let's use healthcare, okay? If you want to, there are really good, political salespeople for universal healthcare. There are some people who are not as good at it. I think I could never be a streamer for a lot of reasons, but I feel like this weird guilt and anxiety about not being able to read all of the comments. Like Lanny said something about she said a lot, and I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch this so I can actually digest everything everybody said. But she said something about Destiny being able to, use his rhetorical advantage to wipe the floor with people.
I mean, he is very skilled at debate.
Yeah. Okay. So if we're in agreement that a person can be better at making arguments, then there are better ways to make arguments.
Okay.
We are not necessarily in disagreement on what we are supposed to be arguing for. I'm not advocating for a sacrifice of our principles. I am just saying that we should be not just more careful, but I am entirely unconvinced that the way that we are advocating for the people we care about is particularly effective. Because I think the proof is in the pudding of like, look around. Obviously we're not doing as good of a job as we could.
But then you make that argument, but then I can respond, look at the Civil War. Couldn't they have done a better job of figuring out how to end slavery? Of course not. The South actively wanted to fight to the end to preserve slavery because it was beneficial to them, and that was where they were. Like, you can't, there's no pleasing the horde, right? I do think there are ways to argue better, don't get me wrong. Like, I always advocate for us to have good optics in what we argue for. Like, there's a difference between me going on stream and screaming at like a random person who's like, I don't really get the whole non-binary thing, like, you're a fucking transphobe, you transphobic monster, you canceled, like, I think there's a big difference between doing that and making the left look like a bunch of nut jobs. There we have agreement. And I do think that there are plenty of people in the online left and in the online trans community that do engage in that behavior, and that's what I have an issue with. I think that a far better way to engage in this advocacy is more like what I do. Staying calm, explaining it, citing sources when I deem necessary, and it may be long-winded, but I mean, the same people that you're saying can be influenced by these ideas are the same people that, at least in large number, listen to the Joe Rogan Experience and Tucker Carlson. These are two of the largest shows watched by Americans, period. Okay? Like, I don't know. It just seems like the idea that the explanation for why an idea is correct is too long-winded has never been an excuse before.
I completely disagree. I mean,
can you give me an example?
With the end statement, just of that, it's almost like you're saying, but correct me because I assume I'm wrong. It sounds like you're saying that there is no way to get somebody who's not currently on the same page as you on this issue in a way that isn't long-winded.
I'm not a scientist, and I'm not like I'm not Bill Nye. Like, maybe if I had Bill Nye, I could like talk to him for a bit and he could find a way to make like the topic of climate change is really complicated. Like, if you came on here and were like, I don't really know about this whole climate change thing, I'd probably have to go on just as long-winded of a rant, citing just as many sources to prove climate change is real. Or you can get Bill Nye to go onto his show and do a kid's explanation for why climate change is real and explain that really complicated concept in a simple, easy way to kids. And I guess maybe we could have like a simple, easy way to explain gender to kids, but that's actively what we're advocating for. And that's what the right is like basing in a massive amount of the culture war on, the idea that like pro-trans or anything talking about gender or sexuality is being discussed in any form in any kids' media or in schools. Like, that is literally part of the biggest part of their culture war narrative. I don't know. It doesn't seem like dumbing down the ideas to be simpler for people does it, you know?
So one of the chats that I did just read was somebody who said, Munchman, I love that name, Munchman, you try to please the right and you lose. Yeah, totally. You do. I'm not advocating for pleasing the right. You do, like when you go try to get typically a Democrat, because that, at least in purple states where I live, it's a Democrat or a Republican, you don't knock on Republican doors. Okay. So I'm not trying to convince
You're trying to
Republicans.
please the middle, the centrists, right?
I'm not even trying to please them. I am trying to communicate to them in a way that gets them on board with my position, which might be farther to the left than they would normally be.
What
And
is your
think
position?
about it as like think of it like a sneaky way to get your political beliefs
Okay.
into office,
All right.
right?
I think I understand
So
what you
that they're
mean.
represented.
I think I understand what you mean. When I talk to somebody about gender and sex, it doesn't usually go as far as our conversation has gone. Usually I find that to get somebody like to level 1, okay, trans people are cool, you just got to show them the data about like dysphoria, the data showing that trans people, like gender dysphoria is real, that the proper treatment for it is acceptance, transitioning, yada yada, and then show like the data that shows that like it's not socially spread by like telling kids that gender is fake and then kids decide they're trans, like that's not real. Like you just have to show them that data, and it's very easy to like level 1, you're cool with trans people, we could end it right there and you're better off than like 99.9% of the average American voter, right? Maybe not that many, but like a lot of the American voter base, you get them to that position, which isn't too hard, and you've basically got them like where you need them to be for the sake of current pragmatic electoral stuff, right? That's all you need to do to get like your average voter on board with like the trans thing, period. Non-binary and xenogender stuff is like so online. I mean, you should know this. You've done canvassing. The vast majority of voters are not on the internet, especially if we're talking about like the center left, kind of like purple kind of people. These are like older people who aren't really online. They don't know about this kind of shit. But the mainstream media has really pushed the binary trans stuff. And that's what's really relevant right now to the broad, to like the current mainstream stuff outside of the internet. We're pushing for a much more radical, we're in a much more radical Overton window online than we are in real life. But like in real life, I'd say we're doing a pretty good job. Like, even though there are some examples of like really bad shit happening, you've seen my stream coverage of it, I think that broadly, and I've said this for a while, we are heading in the right direction. If you look back historically, the right always takes a step forward and then 2 steps back. They always have a big surge right before a big win for progressive lefties, or like civil rights or whatever, right? They always push harder than ever right before they're about to lose the most ground. And it feels as though you're seeing them fighting harder than ever while they're about to lose ground, which is what's going to happen. They're about to lose way more ground than they had before, not even in the long run, over the next couple of years. And I know people may suffer in the next couple of years because policies get passed. I don't think changing how we talk about this is going to affect that. I just don't believe it. I can't be on board. There's no evidence for it. It just doesn't seem like that's how things work. I don't know. I can't see into that reality where we don't talk about non-binary and we don't talk about xenogender, we don't talk about neopronouns, and then the don't say gay bill doesn't pass, and the general inspection bills don't pass, and the fucking trans sports bills don't pass. It just doesn't seem like that's what happens in that reality when 99.999% of this discussion to the broader public is happening about binary trans people, and the propaganda that is being spread is as easy to debunk as trans women are men trying to go into women's restrooms to assault them. Actually, the data all shows that trans women are way more likely to be victims of assault than cis women. Yeah, like it's pretty easy to respond to stuff like that, and that is where the current real life right is at. When it gets to the xenogender neopronoun stuff, we can get onto that road in the main public discourse, I guess, but the idea that the average voter knows about it even isn't really that accurate. Most of the conversation publicly, most of the gender, trans-related, culture war, single-issue voter kind of stuff is happening around binary trans people, particularly trans women, in sports and in bathrooms and in schools. That is where the discussion is being centered right now.
Okay, so one thing that I think that Lanny was in on this conversation on Twitter, but I had posed the question does. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. If I were a good boy, I would pull it up. But I'm not. So it was something to the effect of, if you are not, you don't think that uh, non-binary people belong in the same category as trans, at what I, at that point in the conversation, had referred to as traditional trans people. So I guess binary trans people.
That's generally the term. Yeah.
If okay, if you don't believe that they should be in the same category, does that make you transphobic? Some people said yes, some people said no, and there was a lot of, I think, understandable assumptions about where I landed on that. And it very quickly into a conversation about, like, well, it's typically that's used in a way to invalidate the experience of, and so then I said, okay, but what if, why can't, and I would love for you to answer this because I just genuinely don't know, why couldn't it be the case that we could just, like, in the way that we have cis people, and I realize that gay people are not, it's not a gender identity, but we have different categories of people. What would be the harm in having, like, a distinct non-binary category? So, like, trans,
There is one. Like, I feel like you're sort of seeing a kind of a community-based categorization that isn't really accurate to the broader, like, sort of academic and medical, well, there's not much medical, but academic and philosophical applications of gender. So when we're looking at binary, okay, what about lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, ace people, and trans people means they should be included under the same umbrella? Sure, gay, lesbian, bi, pan, and ace people are discriminated against around their sexuality, who they're attracted to. Trans people are
sound like an old man.
for...
Can you tell me what you mean by ace?
Asexual.
Okay. I know.
Oh, yeah, sorry. There's asexual and aromantic. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
So, granted, these are based around your attraction, your sexuality, but transgender is based around your identity and your gender and your sex, right? Like, that's more or less what that's encompassing. Doesn't really have anything to do specifically with being gay or having any particular attraction to anybody. And yet we include this group under the same LGBT plus umbrella because this is a group of people whose gender and sexual identity lands outside of the norm of our society and thus makes them vulnerable to attacks from, all sorts of people, right? And that is why the LGBT community kind of formed. The reason why non-binary people are kind of included by a broad majority of the trans community, it seems, is because non-binary people are also in the same sort of place, in many cases, as binary trans people. Even if they, they identify as a gender different from that they were assigned at birth, they are the subject to discrimination, bullying, and harassment due to that. Trust me, if you've ever seen transphobic circles, they aren't any easier on non-binary people than they are on binary trans people. I promise you that. There is a purpose in categorizing both groups under the trans umbrella, but just because they're under the same umbrella doesn't mean we can't acknowledge the differences. Even on a nuanced individual level, for individual people, we acknowledge the differences. And
we could also do that if they were in a different category of their own, and not. And the point I made was
we could, but why? Like, it doesn't matter. It's not hurting anybody.
I think it is. Okay, I could argue that there are. Just from a purely practical political standpoint, it introduces a lot of complications, which we don't need more of when you are on the defense, because in the fight for trans rights, in a lot of the political arenas, the folks who want what is best for trans people and want them to have rights and protection and all that good stuff, we're not doing very well. And when you are not doing very well, you need to simplify things so that you aren't still getting your butt kicked. There are other reasons why one could argue that there are some like potential cons. All I'm asking you is, even if you took that aside, I'm just trying to get a genuine understanding of what is the necessity of having them under one like existing umbrella,
But
as opposed to
they're subcategories though, right? Like binary, we've been saying it, non-binary and binary trans people. Like it just seems non-binary trans people, binary trans people. Like why is it not like we have
because
like,
I don't think that the average voter even knows
LGBT.
what the
We've got it doesn't matter that the average voter doesn't know.
Yes, it does.
We have to like.
Of course it does. How do you think that the people who are passing
because we can educate them.
It does.
We can educate them though.
That is, I love you, Zan, but that feels like such a privileged point of view, because
but your position is even more privileged. I'm arguing in defense of the groups that are being discriminated against. I'm arguing, but you're saying we can't put aside the rights and the fight and the struggle of this marginalized group, and you're saying we should you would for optics.
No, I am not. I'm not saying putting aside their rights. I'm not even saying that we should.
We're asking them to essentially wait for a more convenient season.
I'm not saying that either.
It feels that way.
I'm sorry that it feels that way. I
don't feel like I'm alone either.
I know, and that's very frustrating. I mean, like, at least you're in good company. Like I'm trying to figure out, for me, I'm trying to figure out, how do I communicate the shared general agreement that there is here? Because I do think that like 99% of everything that we're talking about, we are in complete agreement on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to figure out, how do I communicate that to somebody who is the person or group of people who decide who gets elected and who doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And because those people who get elected quite often are horribly demonic anti-trans people or non-binary. What I'm trying to figure out here is, how do we make the political reality aligned with the philosophy and academic agreement?
I don't
think that there's, I don't get the harm in, but if there is one, I want to understand it. What is the harm, and how does it have anything to do with denying the rights of a group of people by saying you have a special category?
Mm-hmm. They do have a special category, but excluding them essentially means that so the reasons why non-binary people's identities are valid hinge on the presupposition of binary trans people being valid in their identity as well. You have to already be on board with the gender and sex are different things. Sex isn't even binary. Gender certainly has to be something that you can change, and something that you see as like something you identify as, and a social construct even get to that level. Then you get to the topic of, can somebody who is assigned a certain gender at birth change that gender through a certain level of action? And that's something you have to sell people on a lot of the time, and that's the hardest thing to sell a lot of people on. And then from there, if you even want to have the conversation about where else gender can go, that's all its own other thing. I don't understand what you're asking for, because you haven't provided examples of how we are advocating for non-binary people that is causing more harm. And I can't think of anything we could change and how that would make the harm not happen. How would like decategorizing non-binary people as being trans make society more amicable to trans people? It just doesn't work. That's not how society works. Changing the category of something doesn't instantly make people more accepting of it.
So it sounds like you're saying there's simultaneously no reason
people have to be convinced
to have them in a category, but also
well
that
there is, because by like all real practical means they ought to be in the same category. They are both gender identity minorities. That is why they are included in the same category. That's why we include like non-white people under the umbrella of POC, even though we're still capable of operating on an individual basis to like assess the different struggles faced by different like minority groups racially in this country. I don't think that like having these two groups in different subcategories under the same category under an umbrella and then not doing that, it changes anything.
I'm also dealing with the fact that,
not to mention, categorically, non-binary people fit the definition of trans, identifying as a gender different than the one you were assigned at birth, as we go back to the beginning.
Okay. So let's go back then to, and I don't want to, I mean, it's 1 o'clock my time, and
yeah, it's about 11 p.m. for me.
I'm thoroughly frustrated, but also loving this conversation because I knew it was going to be frustrating, but I still asked for it anyway, because I want to not just be right, but I think the same thing that you want in general, which is more rights for good people and less of the bad shit that we're seeing in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm.
But just so we can, I'm going to have to read all the chats because I feel like they're educating me incredibly well and I'm not seeing any of it. Can you just then go back to the neopronouns? And I feel like I'm using the wrong term, and I'm sorry if I am. But at one point, you were describing, I think you said like 99% of the time people are born, and you know, it sounded like you were saying like that 1% are non-binary or use neopronouns.
No. Sorry, my wording there was a bit off. I'd say that the vast, let me just say without any exact percentages, just to get clear, if you were like some primitive human living out in the plains, you know, and you saw a new village member be born into your tribe or whatever, chances are the vast majority of people would only ever even see new babies being born with a penis or a vagina. Even back then, I'm sure there were intersex people. There are definitely intersex people who were born with different genitalia, or both genitalia, different genitalia. There are men that are on Earth right now walking around that don't know they have a uterus inside of them. Like, that's the kind of crazy, cool shit that intersex stuff can cause. And it definitely sort of breaks up the binary belief of sex that we had. But my saying 99% wasn't like, oh, 1 in every 100 is like not that. I meant more so that almost every time a new person is born, they're either born with a vagina or a penis, and then they grow up to be a certain way. And then that sort of informed the way that roles, assignments, and jobs and whatnot were sort of built in our early budding societies. And those conceptions, because they didn't necessarily not work, didn't really get challenged that much in most societies, even up until today. It's only upon more modern scientific and philosophical advancements that we've started to understand where these previously unchallenged ideas came from, realize that they aren't quite as set in stone as we think. There is no stone out in the middle of the desert where God carved man, woman, transgender. Like, that's not how it works. These ideas are categories we made because we're smarter than most other animals and have language, and created these categories for our own benefit. And I think that if we evolve these categories, evolve the language we use, then we will find much more overall end of the day benefit than otherwise. And we can point to like the data of like how people who are trans or non-binary respond to being validated, and how that causes massive decreases in suicidal ideation, depression, etc. See how that validation impacts them positively, and encourage society to move in a direction more amiable to those ideas. I know it sounds crazy. It sounds impossible. We are in the present right now. What happens in the future seems scary, uncertain, and honestly kind of daunting, because it is. When we look at the past, there's this comfort that we can see in what we know has already happened, but the future is scary and we panic and don't really know what to do. But I think if we look to the past, there's a lot we can gain from it than if we try to speculate and make things up about the future.
I don't think I've eaten nearly enough of these THCO gummies to have such deep conversations at this hour.
Did you try DHCO because of me?
No, actually, but I have to say I'm severely disappointed with the product I got.
Really? The gummies?
Yeah.
I recommend Vape Pen. I got a Vape Pen, and that shit had me. It's 3 times stronger than normal weed. Like, at least the Vape Pen I had, I hit it, and I have a high tolerance, and I was just like, I feel like I just hit a vape pen, a concentrate pen for the first time in my life again. It was nuts.
Yeah. To be fair, though, I got really messed up the very first time that I had some Delta 8 gummies like a few months ago, and then like it's just a little relaxing, whichever brand I get or strain. But I want to go back again to the question about xenogender. Is that the This is why, by the way, I proactively called myself OldManLondre, because I knew there would be moments like this where I would be talking to Zoomers who have a much more advanced social vocabulary than I do. Yeah. And it's like, I'm sorry, I want to use the right words, but sometimes I struggle. And I do think that there is a self-defeating issue that I watch happen sometimes in the space that we kind of share, that if you use the wrong term, that you get kind of like dumped on or whatever.
I want to say we can continue if you want, but Lonnie did say in the chat we should put a pin in this combo for now, Xander Hall, and come back to it once we've had time to think about what we've covered so far before getting into xenogender stuff. You'll both be less tired.
That would be good. That would be really good.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to like put a pin in it so we can do a part 2 on xenogender and neopronoun stuff, that would be really cool. Because what we've got up till now, I think, is like the general, like the acceptance of like binary trans people and non-binary trans people is basically where the online left is basically at. Like, there's not that much anti-non-binary sentiment in the online left. Even the real life left has gotten pretty damn amiable to non-binary people. But like when we get into like xenogender, neopronoun stuff, that's when we get into stuff that's contentious even in the left broadly. Yep. So that'll be, and the online left. So that'll be really fun.
Yes, and I think in closing, I feel like I just need to put a little bow on the repeated statement that despite my forthcoming ignorance on some of these things, it does not mean that that I especially, and you even just like touched on it with, like, even within the online left, the thoughts about xenogenders are like I'm not sure, kind of, sometimes, because I asked you earlier and I don't think that you responded, if there is a point where it gets
I wrote that down. Do you want to save that one for our
we totally can
discussion?
I just don't want anybody who might be still listening or listening in the future to have any kind of confusion about the fact that I believe 100% in the complete true validity of the experience of all the different categories of people we're talking about. I'm just trying to figure out how I and people more like me can be the most effective possible advocates for the groups we are talking about. And I'm not convinced that we are doing the best we can as a collective group who wants what is best for this tent of people.
I think there's a lot
Does
of
that
really,
make sense?
I think there's a lot of really interesting conversation to have about this. And I think there is also an interesting conversation separate from that about when it may be more useful to say, we know this is the right thing, but maybe it's not politically expedient to push for. I can think, I'll give you one, like, I'll give you like a little bit of a sort of like concede point in your category. One example of where I think most lefties are willing to sacrifice a little bit of their principles in order to appease the broader voter base, including the right, is probably not mask mandates. I think it was vaccination mandates, in particular, vaccine mandates. This is an issue that for a while was like every lefty was pushing it, but the data is out now that it's such an overwhelmingly unpopular idea that if like Biden or any Democratic politician pushed for it, it would be political suicide. And it's just something that all got shied away from, right? We're not doing that. You don't really see anybody who's on the left that talks about these issues that's really worth their salt advocate for it anymore, because we realize there's just, you can't, like, it would be political suicide to push something like that. And I think there's a discussion to have about that, but I don't think people's rights is that line. Not that I'm saying it is for you. Not that I'm saying that's what you're arguing. But I do want to say a lot of my derision, I guess you could say, in this argument, a lot of my like raised voice or like getting spiced or whatever in this argument was mostly me not just making an argument like against you, but towards you, like for you to assess and consider. More so as well to everybody watching. When I talk about this, I can't just consider what you're hearing, where you're at and where you are. You'll notice that a few times I explain basic concepts to the chat, because I have like a responsibility to make sure the chat watching is also properly educated on it, which makes this conversation a bit harder, because like I have to make sure the first thing I cover is maybe a misconception I think you had that I need to clarify for the chat, and then I get to like the argument. Like it can be hard to have conversations like this publicly when I also have the responsibility of educating my audience too, from my perspective. So it's just like, I don't know. It was fun convo though.
When conversations are very frustrating, they can also be fun sometimes.
Yeah, I did have a fun time though. I mean, it was definitely a good convo, and I'm excited to do the xenogender neopronoun conversation part 2 in the future.
And I hope you will, between then and now, you will watch my video, because I think then it will make a lot more sense where I'm coming from as a like foundation of understanding my primary concern, because there is a reason why I'm not a debate bro streamer, and I do the YouTube thing instead.
Yeah,
because I think I come off by being willing to ask some dumb questions that might seem dumb to a lot of people. They are questions that unfortunately a lot of other people have, but I think people are hesitant to be willing to ask some stupid questions, and that is a unfortunate privilege that somebody like me has. If I were not a progressive person, I could very easily say this doesn't apply to me. This isn't about me. I don't have to do any of this. But as you're pointing out, that's not what it's about. It's about doing the right thing.
Yeah.
But I think in order to get the right thing done, we need to be able to ask some dumb questions, or questions that might seem dumb to some people. And I'm even seeing some comments that I think would give credence to some people who might be too scared to ask some dumb questions. But I'll be the sacrificial lamb so that you can educate me and others who might be equally ignorant, but equally committed to trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, no, totally. It's all good. I actually I sent you a video just now as a little bit of extra homework. You don't have to read like the research doc. I think that probably would be like, if you want to, you can, but if you want to get like the most I would say, entertaining and distilled version of most of the information we discussed here, just to see like someone smarter and more well-versed than me and not off the cuff explain these things. I do recommend the Transgenders video by ContraPoints I just sent you, which gets into the whole non-binary thing and I think does a really good job of explaining it. And then another video was the SciShow video that I sent you, which explains sex and how that's not even binary and does dip a little bit into gender and sexual minorities, but it's mostly about like biological sex. And I do think it's worth watching just to see how wrong society is about the simple, tangible, observable realities of human biology. And once you've seen that, once you start thinking about the gender stuff, you start to realize maybe these conceptions and ideas that I've thought for so long aren't quite as set in stone as I thought. I think it's worth watching.
Cool. I will. I love all of ContraPoint's stuff, and even though I was certainly shared your disappointment in some of those recent drama moments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that we were able to keep it like pretty civil. I'm glad that we're all cool and everything. I hope to definitely get into some exciting stuff in the next conversation. But do you have any final memes, like you want to shout yourself out or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow me on Twitter at OldManLondre, and hopefully I'm at like 750 subs, so I'm getting really close on YouTube to the magical 1,000 number. So if you are here watching and don't despise me at this point for asking these dumb questions, you can certainly try to hopefully help me get up to the 1,000 mark.
Hell yeah. Alrighty, go check out OldManLondre, and definitely keep your eye out for part 2 of this conversation. I'll be sure to advertise it as such whenever it's on the horizon. Anyway, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a fun conversation, but I think I got to wrap up stream because I've been live for 6 hours.
I love you, Zan and Lonnie, and all of the chatters. Thank you for helping to educate me, and so on and so forth.
Oh yeah, thank you. Have a good one, okay?
You too.
See ya. That was a fun combo. I do feel like we talked past each other a little bit for a while. But what I'm hoping is, because sometimes with an issue like this, it's like one of those things you have to sleep on, and then you're like, oh, you know, and it can be hard to like change your mind like in front of an audience. So maybe next time I talk to him and he's like, okay, I understand where you're coming from now, but I'm not going to like ascribe the future like that. I mean, it's just, conversations like that can be a little bit confusing up front and needs time to be digested. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, it'll be interesting to see like after the introspection where we're at.